You see the title of this evening. It's both an assertion and it's a demand. Tibet was never part of China, and second part, farewell to the one China policy. With our guests here on stage, we are exploring these two statements within this evening. Because our guests bring different backgrounds and different perspectives to the table. I will introduce them to you in a moment, and I will ask them a first question at the same time. We are not English alone, our mother tongue or for everyone here, so we will try to speak a little bit slowly, so in order that the translation is able to follow us. Okay, my name already mentioned is Tanja Signori. I'm a lecturer in global communication at the ZHW, Zürcher Hochschule für angewandte Wissenschaften, and freelance coordinator. And I'm looking forward to our discussion today. I welcome first the Honorable Secretary of the Central Tibetan Administration, Pemba Tsering. Pemba Tsering, you have been Secretary since May of this year. Before this, for 2 terms between 2008 and 2016, you were the Speaker of the Parliament of the Central Tibetan Administration. I want to ask you first a very huge question. China's invasion of Tibet happened 71 years ago. What future do you see for Tibet?
China. Our language came from India. Our religion also came from India. separation. As much as His Holiness recites, saying that we are asking for autonomy through the Middle Way approach, China keeps calling His Holiness Dalai Lama as a separatist. So you really don't know whether China wants Tibet to be separated from China, or His Holiness is seeking separation from China, or the Central Tibetan administration is seeking separation from China. It depends on the Chinese government what they want to do. But in the meantime, until such a lasting solution is found, we will be refocusing and reorienting our efforts in understanding the reality of the situation in Central Tibet, and then increase our international efforts at advocacy to reach out to governments as much as possible. Today morning, I had some meetings with relevant authorities of the Swiss government, and we also had a meeting with the Interparliamentary Council of Tibet in the Bundesgas here in Bern. This is my first visit to Bern, and it was quite productive. I have not shied away from saying what I need to tell the relevant authorities about what we feel about the Swiss government's relationship with China. It's not enough that Swiss is free. It's not enough that Swiss people are rich. You have too much money and then you only focus on money. Just like what China is doing, because China also thinks that the solution to every problem is development, not really understanding the aspiration of the Tibetan people in our efforts to preserve our language, our culture, our religion, our way of life, and more particularly Tibet's environment. You have the Alps here, we have bigger Alps in the Himalayas. We call ourselves the land of sand-surrounded snow mountains. Westerners started calling Tibet as the roof of the world. Asians call Tibet as the water tower of Asia because all the major rivers in the Asian subcontinent flow from Tibet, originate from Tibet, and today Chinese environmental scientists call Tibet as the third pole because of the amount of ashes and permafrost that feeds all these major rivers in Asia. So environment is not a political issue. So also I say human rights is also not a political issue. It's a moral issue that the Swiss government should take up with the Chinese government. And China respects only strength, not weakness. And the reason why China tried to reach out to Switzerland, not the other European countries, because they're trying to find a foothold in the European sphere. Therefore, I would like to request the Swiss government to be more strong when it comes to China. And I also request the Swiss business people to be a little bit mindful of cherishing the values that we have here. When you do business with China, then you also become complicit in what they are doing to the Tibetans or the Uyghurs or the Mongols, and whatever China is doing today, the belligerence against India on Taiwan and South China Seas, deteriorating a trade war with the United States or with the EU. I also take this opportunity to tell the EU countries that they should have a broader, more common foreign policy, not fragmented foreign policy. They should also have a common trade policy when it comes to China, because China is playing the same game European colonials used to play against the colonized country at that time, divide and rule, carrot and stick. They are using the same thing against the European Union today. So that is, I think, we can't just rest on the past, but look forward into the future, and we really look forward to a negotiated, mutually beneficial, lasting solution to Tibet that's beneficial both for China as a state and Tibetans as a people.
Thank you a lot for this overview, or a lot of topics we want to talk about this evening. I would like to introduce our second guest. It's Professor Michael von Wald. He's Professor for International Law, mediator, and advisor to the Tibetan government in exile. Professor von Wald like in your book you explain, and similar to what we have heard recently, you explain why Tibet was never part of China. Can you tell us very briefly what you base this statement on? Yeah, you have to share the microphone and I hope it works. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here. It's working, is it? Yes. Not working?
Could you say
All right. I'm just not used to speaking in church. So, let me first say that the book is the result of a 10-year project which we, the co-author and Walter Smith, engaged in with about 100 scholars in different parts of the world, universities around the world. The objective was, in the first place, to understand what the principal obstacle is to resolving the Sino-Tibetan conflict. And we studied history precisely because China has put history at the center of the conflict. Does so in two ways. Firstly, because China claims the right to rule Tibet, to be in Tibet, to own Tibet, only on the basis that Tibet was a part of China since antiquity. It does not claim the right to rule Tibet because it conquered Tibet. It does not claim the right to rule Tibet because it has effective control in Tibet today, or for any other reason. The only source of claim legitimacy to rule Tibet is history, from their point of view. That is why it becomes very important to study history, because that is the center of the conflict. Also because they require that Soyun Sadhana make a statement, public statement, that Tibet is ultimately part of China before any substantive negotiations can take place. So for both these reasons we studied it. We approached the study from all different perspectives, which is why we worked with Mongolists, with Sinologists, with people who are experts in Persian history, with people who are experts in Manchu sources, Tibetologists, and many others. In order to understand how, at any particular time in history, since the 13th century, since Genghis Khan, how the relations between the various rulers in Asia were understood, how they understood their relations with each other, how they understood their political entities, how they understood the empires that existed at the time. And we find that there are different ways in which the Mongols, the Tibetans, the Manchus, the Chinese viewed these things. We in Europe in particular, but also in the West in general, have been exposed primarily to the cynic, the Chinese way of viewing Asia and their role in Asia, and their relation with other rulers and countries in Asia. And that is because, of course, one of the important disciplines here has been sinology, and less so Mongolists and Tibetologists and so on. But also because some of the sources were not as easily available in the past as they are today. There are more scholars today that have studied the Manchu language, that can read Manchu. There are more scholars today that have access to Mongolian archives, because Mongolia is now no longer part of the Soviet bloc and the archives are open, and so forth. And so the result is that we're getting a very different understanding now after the study of the place of Tibet in Asia and its relations with others. And to just say that the principal conclusion that we reached is that Tibet was, in fact, never at any point in history a part of China. This does not mean that Tibet did not have relations with the Mongols. It does not mean that it did not have relations with the Manchus. It does not mean that there weren't dependency or interdependency relations between rulers, Tibetans and other rulers. In fact, there were, especially with the Mongols, but also with the Manchus. But there is a very clear distinction between the relations that the Mongols had with the Tibetans and the authority that they may have exercised in Tibet, and the authority and relations that existed between the Manchus and the Tibetans and China. These relations did not make Tibet part of China. And this is something that I think we have not understood well because of this Chinese approach to history that we have been learning or have been exposed to, is that the Mongol Empire was not a Chinese empire, the Manchu Empire was not a Chinese empire, and that both the Mongol and the Manchu emperors were very careful to keep Tibet and their relations with Tibet separate from their occupation and subjugation of China. And this is what we have to keep in mind, and the consequence of that is Tibet was not a part of China when China invaded Tibet. China could not have acquired sovereignty over Tibet by invading Tibet with force, because international law does not allow the acquisition of sovereignty of territory through the use of force. And therefore Tibet today is still not legally speaking a part of China. It is an occupied country, an illegally occupied country, and our governments should not be recognizing in any way, explicitly or implicitly, that Tibet is part of China. So this has nothing specifically to do with One China policy. I'll talk about that in a moment. But it is not only important that our governments do not recognize Tibet as part of China because it is illegal for them to do so, and you should remind your governments that it is illegal for them to do so. They violate international law when they recognize Tibet part of China, but also because the only reason or incentive for the Chinese government to be willing to negotiate with Tibetans is for them to receive from the Tibetans legitimacy for their rule of Tibet, which they know very well they do not have. And so the moment that others create an environment in which China can believe it has legitimacy, because all these countries are saying that Tibet's part of China, Chinese leaders have no more reason to work with Tibetans. They have no more reasons to speak to the Dalai Lama or anyone else to negotiate an agreement that will satisfy both sides.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for this interesting aspects. Vijay Kranti was nodding all the time. I'll give you the briefing in a second. I'd like to present you Vijay Kranti. He's of Kashmir origin. He has over 50 years of experience in journalism and in photography. And as a journalist, his main areas of specialization are Tibet, China, and Kashmir. Vijay, do you agree with my report?
Yes, of course. My friend Juan and Katarina have made my job very easy to say what I want to say. So whatever I will say will be very simple language. But before I say, I bring greetings to all of you on a very special day. It is a very special night for me. And 100 million Indians. Today is Diwali night. It's just like Christmas for me. And the people from other nationalities are joining this new Lord a lesson for Hamari Pados Desh, which means our neighboring nations, neighboring countries. That was India. And one chapter was exclusively on Tibet. So, when a scholar like Michael van Walt or very learned leader like Matsei, they talk about Tibet as a federation. You know, they are authorities in their field. And I was as a child. My school book told me Tibet was a neighbor nation, a free nation, which is itself not a small weakness, because Tibet was always a free nation, a very peaceful neighbor of India. We have a common border with Tibet from Ladakh via Himachal Pradesh and Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, and Arunachal Pradesh. This length is 4,000 plus kilometers. In our history, not even 1 inch of this border, not even for one day in the history of the last 100, 500, 1,000, 2,000, 300, 3,000 years, China was never present. It was always there. And we had cultural relations. My forefathers would walk into Tibet without a passport, without visa, and go to Mount Kailash to pay obedience to Lord Shiva. The Tibetans would walk free without any passport, without any visa, all along Indian borders to India to pay obedience to Lord Buddha, to visit Sarnath, to visit all other Kushinagar and other places. So for me, Tibet has been always a free country. Tibet has never been a part of China. When I see history, Tibet had its own national flag, it had its own national currency, it had its own postal stamps, which we used to give to Tibet as Indians. And not on this 4,000 kilometer long border. I don't think we had policemen or army more than 100 people. All along, it was peaceful, brotherly area. So when we talk of legal issues, to me it appears that those legal issues stand on their own feet on one point. And witness of a 5 or 6 or 7 year old child standing on one point. So for me, Tibet has been always a part of, always an independent nation, part of peaceful, part of neighbor to India, Nepal, Bhutan, etc. When I see a realize, I like to see the history of when China says one-China policy. I go to the history which was visible to you and all of us. We are not going to old days of the Mongol rulers. We just last century, in 1912, today's China was a different China. It was a very small on the map, and I have shown you we had a projector. I studied it. And if at all there was other China, it was divided into British China, French China, Portuguese China, German China, Japanese China, and China, Tibet's and China's neighbors were two countries. Tibet, East Turkestan, Mongolia. India was never a neighbor of China. So today, when they claim it is one China and they say one China policy, I can only laugh at it. I'm shocked at it. So, in 1912, Sun Yat-sen was the first to create the Republic of China. And then Chiang Kai-shek replaced him through his own violence. And what he did first time, he occupied South Mongolia in 1990. South Mongolia became a part of China in 1990. China expanded it. And then other colonies were also included. In 1935, Manchuria was invaded and occupied by China. It became a part of China, but Manchuria these days are saying it is something funny. It is not Chinese. Manchurian. We have lost their culture, we have lost their identity, we have lost their language. Occupied by China, Han Chinese. In 1946, Chiang Kai-shek occupied East Pakistan and Republic of China became big. In 1949, when he came, Mao Zedong, you know, when the Uyghur people, the Uzbekis or the other people, they were fighting against the Chinese invasion. Mao Zedong, as a very great orator, said, hey, well, we should not fight. We are friends, we are brothers, we belong to the same family, let us not. So both Uyghurs agreed to talk. So Mao Zedong organized an aeroplane with the help of Soviet Union, Stalin, and others. And all these poor Uyghur leaders were very simple people, who were very fascinated by seeing an aeroplane. So they boarded that aeroplane to talk Mao Zedong. And you know that aeroplane has not been arrived today. The plane exploded on the way, and the entire leadership of East Turkestan, the peoples, was blasted in one go. So you can imagine the culture of dialogue of communists. So when they talk of one China policy, and in 1951, Mao came, in 49 Mao had come to power, and he occupied Tibet, and China became a huge with a new neighbor as India, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan as new neighbors. So when they talk of one China policy, I laugh at them, I feel pity for their lives.
Thank you, Richard, for sharing your childhood memories with us. I would like to go on with the illustration. Thank you. Yeah, because we have two other guests I would like to introduce to you. We have our next guest, Regula Rix. She is the National Councillor for the Swiss Green Party. We have heard a lot about demands. For the Swiss government concerning Tibet. You, Regula Rix, you are also representative of the parliamentary group Tibet. What are your goals in this group? And what are you doing here with these demands, for example, in that of City of Bekozir?
Thank you for the invitation. It's a great honor for me to participate at the first visit of our city on the Central Tibet Administration and myself group. I'm so happy to discuss a topic with you which is very important for me because, as you told, I'm a member of this parliamentary group of Tibet, and we're working on two different levels. The first step is that we are in permanent dialogue with the Tibetan community here in Switzerland, and it is a very large community, one of the largest in Europe. So every day we're discussing together, also especially about the very dangerous and difficult situation in Tibet. This gives us a lot of information and also a lot of energy to discuss with the government, because the interesting thing is that Switzerland was in former years very open to Tibet refugees and the Tibetan community coming here after the bloody suppression of the Tibetan uprising in 1959. Switzerland was one of the first countries opening borders for Tibetan refugees. And what is for me very interesting is that Tibetans they became to a very important part of our culture and religion in our diverse society in Switzerland, with a lot of sympathy of the civil society. And civil society in Switzerland, for them, Tibet is not a country, is a free country, or is not a free country, but an independent country occupied by a superpower. And that's the mentality here, and it's completely different to what our government does and thinks. And this is, for me, it's an interesting gap also, this between the population this question on Tibet. Tibet is not a part of China for most of the people who live in Switzerland, because they're speaking to you every day, they are working with you every day, and they see also the sufferings of your relatives and friends that stayed in Tibet and they cannot be here. And what we do in the second level is to make pressure to the government. Our parliamentary group is very interesting because there are deputies of all the parties represented in parliament, and we're always talking with the foreign minister. It was about 70, I have a list here, Thomas made a list. In the last 14 years, there was more than 70 questions, demands, initiatives, which we gave to the government to ask the government to respect the human rights policy, to not do a foreign policy which only is focused on the economic things, because all the foreign policy in Switzerland is not a foreign policy, it's a foreign trade policy. And with this free trade agreement, the first time in Europe, a free trade agreement with China, it is completely clear that Swiss companies, Swiss banks, they're going to have an advantage to other companies in other countries in Europe to have a special relation to Chinese markets, which are very large. And this is what we don't accept. For us, it is clear Switzerland has always had a tradition on humanity. It is the founding state of the Red Cross. We have in Geneva, we have the High Commission for refugees, but also for human rights, and a country which has really this history and also this mentality that for us it is important thing that we are part of a world living in freedom together as respecting the human rights. It is not possible and not acceptable that our government is only focused on this completely economic view of the things. So we just do everyday work to change this, and I think we have at the moment really a different situation that is more openness. It's the first time that our foreign minister told openly in the parliament that the things are really bad in China, also in Tibet, that human rights are not respected, that China does not take the promises they gave us, they don't respect them. And it's the first time that our government told that maybe they would think about being represented at the opening of the Olympic Winter Games in China next year. So something is changing, and we could discuss this after. And I think it has something to do with the Corona experience here, that all Switzerland is so dependent on China, and a lot of countries in the world nowadays see that we're completely dependent on China, and that is not good also for the development of our countries.
Yes, I hope we will be able to talk about these economic dependencies in Switzerland, or which Switzerland seems to have from China, and also about this shift in opinion we have in Switzerland. But first, I would like to introduce to you Wolf Bachig, our next guest. He's an author and publisher, and also you are nodding all the time. I've seen it. So I think we agree with each other here on the stage. But Wolf Bachig, he lived on the island of Taiwan for several years. He learned Chinese there, and his life is Taiwanese, so he knows the region. And I would like to ask you, Wolf, we see here Freiheit, Frieden für Tibet, gegen das Vergessen, we shall not forget Tibet. But I have the impression you have a lot of coverage about the People's Republic of China in Swiss and European media in the world. We have also a lot of critical media reports in Switzerland, but Tibet seems to have disappeared from the media. There's nothing about Tibet. Why is it so?
Yes. I 100% agree with the goal of this conference here.
because there is not only one China, there are two Chinas. The first is the People's Republic of China and Mainland, and the second one is the Republic of China and Taiwan. I lived there from 1980 to 1995. And when my wife, Liti, and me, we settled down, we were just in the eye of the storm of democratization of this country. When we went there, this year, the martial law was lifted, existed from 1948 to 1987. President Jiang Jing-won was one of the sons of President Chiang Kai-shek before. He wanted to open the country. They started even sooner. 1975, 76, they allowed candidates to participate in local elections, the so-called Gangwai. Gang is a political party. Wai means outside the Kuomintang, outside the Nationalist Party. And this was the base of the later opposition. Then, half a year later, Jiang Jing-won died. Li Denghui, he became the first president, was born in Taiwan. And in this year also, political reforms continued. Then we came to 1989. We all know there was the massacre of Tiananmen in Beijing, which destroyed the democratic movement. At the same time, in Taiwan, we had also a student democratic movement. And what happened to them? They were received by President Li Denghui. The main goal was that the officials, the officers of the army, they had to go out of the campuses of the universities and high schools. And President Li Denghui and the government, they agreed. They did like that. So we see the difference. I think 1989 was a very, very important year because in Taiwan, democratization took way. But in China, every political reform was dead until now. And afterwards, in 1991, there were also some other laws, the rest of the martial law was also lifted. In the year of 2000, with the change regime, it was the first time that the opposition, the Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, was elected president. So why am I telling you this? Because for me it's very, very strange that we here in Switzerland, we have a democratic country, we have all of the liberties, but our government always wants to have a good relationship, to get friends with Beijing and China. Indeed, we don't have any diplomatic ties with Taiwan. Why is that so? And that's also one of my goals. I think we should, here in Switzerland, also the people like me and all the Swiss should be very be aware and follow of the democratization of Taiwan, because the Chinese government in Beijing is always telling democracy is not a Chinese idea, it's only a Western idea. But in Taiwan, we live now 30 years with a democratic system in the country. And I think the goal that we have to finish with this one China policy is very, very important.
Thank you for this. Do we have so few media coverage about the debate? Might people do you have an idea? Is it a lack of information coming from Tibet? Or is it the control of the Chinese propaganda? Or why do we have so few?
I think it's a combination of some of the things you've said and some other things as well. I think especially in the last 20 years, we have been commissioned by Chinese propaganda to talk about Tibet and the press to write about Tibet. Firstly, as a region about, when the press talks about Tibet, they talk about Taiwan, they talk about Taiwan. When they talk about Tibet, they talk about the western region of China. When they talk about Taiwan, they say Taiwan, which the People's Republic of China, or Beijing, or Chinese leaders consider the province of China. When they talk about Tibet, they don't say which the Chinese government considers a province or autonomous region of China. So we have the press, it's not just media, it's the general public, it's governments as well, have been adopting the concepts and the language and terminology that the PRC wants us to use. How often do you hear people talk about the Tibetan minority, or Tibetans as a minority of China, as an ethnic group of China? Tibetans are neither a minority nor an ethnic group. In the first place, you're not a minority of your own country. So Tibetans can't be a minority in Tibet. So the only reason that China wants us to use the term minority is one, because it implies Tibet is part of China, because it wouldn't be a minority of China. But secondly, because the rights of minorities are a lower category of rights than the rights of a people or of an occupied country. Tibetans are a people by any legal definition. They are not a minority. And yet we read in the press all the time, and our governments talk about Tibetans as a minority, a religious ethnic minority. This has to stop, because it is a product that China uses. To some extent, it's the same with the One China policy. We need to remember that the One China policy was developed at the time that the United States recognized the People's Republic of China in 1979. It was the US policy to accept that there were not two Chinas. In other words, the US said, agreed with the PRC that there is not a Republic of China and the People's Republic of China. There's not two countries with the name China, but there's not two governments that can say they're the government of China. That is the One China policy. Now, what is important to know also is that this does not, although the United States, in other words, accepts the One China policy and each administration repeats it, this does not entail that the United States recognizes the sovereignty of the People's Republic of China over Taiwan. And that's a very important distinction. And it also does not mean that they cannot have relations with Taiwan, sell them arms, naval ships, air force planes to defend themselves against the People's Republic of China. But Tibet has nothing to do with this. And this is why I say it's part of this language trick that China uses, because when countries have accepted the One China policy in relationship with China, just like the US did, this relates to Taiwan. Then China comes back and says, oh, but you've accepted the One China policy, so you can't be meeting with Tibetan leaders. It has nothing to do with Tibet. Tibetan government has never claimed to be China or to be the government of China. So the two are completely unrelated. But China, in other words, has used the fact that they have gotten countries to accept the One China policy, to then expand it and say, no, once you've used it, then you can't do this with Tibet, you can't recognize that Tibet is not part of China, you can't do it with East Turkestan, you can't meet their leaders, etc. With Hong Kong, they are applying it as well. And many governments are not even aware that they're stepping right into this trick. So now we have governments that say, oh, but we accepted the One China policy, so we can't do this, we can't do that. There's nothing to do with it. And we need to remind our governments to separate that.
Yes, so let's turn the focus really back to Tibet. Thank you, David. You mentioned tonight
same time, we have to understand the reality of the situation inside Tibet. The first years of Chinese occupation brought a lot of misery to the Tibetan people. We have never experienced famine as much as after China occupied Tibet. There was hunger, there was famine, there was death, there was repression, there was genocide, there was destruction of monasteries, there was marginalization of Tibetans. Everything happened in the first 15, 16 years, also during the 10 years of Cultural Revolution. And it was during this period when His Holiness first started thinking about the middle approach, as he says in his discourses, that he started thinking about this way back in 1973, 74. It was a concern here is the existential problem of the Tibetans as a people, as a nation. Therefore, if there is no Tibetan people, if there is no Tibetan identity, then a land alone does not make sense. That is why His Holiness went for middle approach and he started propounding this in the 1987 5-point peace proposal, 1988 Strasbourg proposal. Even today, I tell my these facts are coming into light very prominently now that Tibet was an independent country. It's not just Michael's work that is in the public domain now. We also have a Chinese Professor Wang, who is based in San Diego today, who is a professor in the University of City University of Hong Kong, and now based in San Diego. And he also written a book. And he's quite old, as he tells us that he wants to start from the nearest time, Confucius. So, and he refers all his sources to the Chinese imperial records. Chinese imperial records never ever recognized Tibet as part of China. But despite all these facts, I tell our Tibetan friends, of course we have Tibetans within particularly the other generation of Tibetans who believe that we should fight for independence. But the problem is, I also tell them, another 20, 30 years down the line, forget about independence, even autonomy may not make sense. I also say we don't have time. Why? Time is always there. But why there is no time for Tibet? Because of Chinese demographic aggression in Tibet. Even though Tibet is 2.37 square kilometers, many times the size of Switzerland, more and more Chinese are moving into Tibet. If China is free, we are not against multiculturalism, but the majority community, completely overwhelming minority community is not acceptable to us. Therefore, we went for it. Then the reality of the situation today is, are we or will we be able to maintain our identity in Tibet? If we talk about language, which I referred to earlier, is very important as the basis of our culture and religion. During Mao's time, they had to use Tibetan because no Tibetans speak Chinese, because Tibet was a part of China and no Tibetans learned Chinese. There was no need to. But during Mao's time, they had to use Tibetan language for propaganda purposes. After Mao's death, after the end of the Cultural Revolution, after the Panchen Rinpoche was released, then there was still freedom in Tibet in the 80s. And Panchen Rinpoche played a very crucial and significant role in bringing back the value of Tibetan language, bringing back the value of Tibetan culture, Buddhism. But unfortunately, he had a very untimely death. And many of us feel that he has been poisoned to death. Even though there's no proof, there's no post-mortem, there's no autopsy done on his body. So, in terms of language also, during then, Eugene Gaoki and his party secretary, there was martial law in the late 80s. And Chiang Zemin's time deteriorated, the situation deteriorated, and they started calling His Holiness monks and groups slowly. That was the state of affairs. Hu Jintao came as president in early part of the century, then they were talking about bilingualism, teaching both Tibetan and Chinese. Now, today, in Xi Jinping's time, they start teaching Tibetan from the Montessori stage. So what the Americans did to the natives, what the Canadians did to the First Nations, what the Australians did to the Aborigines, they are doing exactly the same thing to the Tibetans in Tibet, to civilize the Tibetan population, to completely change the mindset of the younger generations of Tibetans and the Chinese. So that is only on the language by extension. In terms of Buddhism also, I won't go back that far into Mao's time because there was a lot of destruction. But in today's time, from Hu Jintao's time, they have to be more quiet. Now they want to be responsible for reincarnation of Tibetan lamas. So His Holiness always says in jest that if the Chinese government is really serious about reincarnation, recognition of reincarnation of lamas, then the Chinese leadership should study Buddhism first. Because they are an atheist government. And His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama is living in India. They don't bother about it. But they are more concerned about the 15th Dalai Lama because they want to control. It's a political decision to abduct the real Ajahn Lama in 1995. And we still don't know whether he is alive or not. So aside from this reincarnation issue, there's so much control of surveillance, control of the movement of monks and nuns. But these, again, by extension, also extends to Tibetan Buddhist culture and environment, as we discussed. So considering the reality of this situation, we fear that if we don't get to go back to Tibet as early as possible with a solution that is mutually beneficial both for China and Tibet,
Yes,
the Tibetan identity itself now there.
you're depicting a really pessimistic picture of the situation in Tibet, but even now you're talking about the dialogue which should be restarted. How could this dialogue be restarted? Through formal or informal channels? What are your ideas?
We have had dialogue with the Chinese from 2000 to 2010. That was mainly Chinese accused students, mainly because of the Chinese Coming Out Party in 2008, organizing the Olympic 2008. And at that time, 8 years ago, His Holiness supported China's organization of the Olympics. His Holiness also supported China's entry into World Trade Organization in the hope that China, once China becomes part of the global community, they will be a more responsible power. Everybody expected that. Today, we realize that it's not so. Today, even in Europe, as you mentioned at the very beginning, there is a changing viewpoint of how China responds to the international community. China's belligerence against me. Of course, it might sound a little pessimistic, but maybe I'll end this on a more optimistic note by saying China's belligerence against India for no reason whatsoever, for no provocation from the Indian government, because Indian government has always taken a very defensive position. China has always taken a very offensive position. Now, why is China threatening Taiwan with a war and occupation? Why is China expanding as this expansionist view on South China Sea? Why is there a China trade war with the United States? Why is there a changing dynamics in relations between China and the European Union? Everywhere, China has problems. That is because China today feels very, very insecure. China talks about harmonious society. China talks about harmonious relations with all its neighbors. What they are doing to its neighbors is not harmonious relations at all. What they are doing to the Uyghurs, what they are doing to the Tibetans and the Congolese is not a harmonious society within China. It's provocation on all fronts. So that is very symptomatic to say that China really feels cornered from the international community from within. The opaqueness of the system does not allow us to understand how much opposition is there to the leadership of Xi Jinping, now who has become so powerful, a man as powerful as Mao, if not more than Mao. So he's also responsible for good things he will do, but he'll also be responsible for failures that he'll have to deal with. And sometimes, as I try as much as possible to try to analyze the situation as to why Xi Jinping wants to go back to socialism, why he's curbing on free trade. You heard the case of Jack Ma. You heard the crisis that everyone is facing now. Why is China's government not coming to the rescue of these businesses that they so promoted in the last several decades, because of which they have attained the economic power that they have today? So all these are pointers to the fact that China does not care about international relations now. They have not attended G20. I was at IPAC there, just next to the Italian Parliament building where the G20 leaders were coming. Xi Jinping was not there. Xi Jinping is not in Glasgow for the COP26. Why is he remaining so secluded from the international community? That is because he is very insecure right now. They fear the end of communism. They fear being cornered from all parts of the international community and within. That is why there may be opportunities for Tibetans, there may be opportunities for Uyghurs, there may be opportunities for Hong Kong, despite the fact that we follow the middle way approach. So the relations keep changing. There is so much fluidity in today's international relations. There's too much dynamics evolving in the formation of Quad, in the formation of AUKUS, in the increased relationship between all these countries that face China. Because today everybody has the strength to talk about China being a threat to the global community. Earlier, we hardly hear that. Today, in Switzerland also, now people are realizing the fact that China is not what it is. It's not only it may be mostly the business community who think that this is an opportunity. And America has experienced this in the last 20 years. They realize that it's not useful. But Switzerland business people will have to wake up to that reality. One day, they might face problems with China because of what China might do to the companies that Swiss companies have invested in. So they have to be mindful of what could be the consequences in future. So that is why we have to understand the reality of the situation. At the same time, be pragmatic in our approach to take up any opportunities that come by while meeting the challenges. We are open to anything that evolves, and we will definitely take the opportunities whenever it comes by.
You mentioned the economic power of China. I would like now to address China's global infrastructure projects. For example, this Belt and Road Initiative, this gigantic transport routes by land and sea China's building up. In your opinion, what are the Chinese objectives of the Belt and Road Initiative?
If we want to understand the objectives of China's Belt and Road Initiative, we have to look at the background of how this is based on the gigantic money China has over the years. And unfortunately, this money came from all democratic countries, the Western countries. Unfortunately, our leaders like Mr. Nixon and Henry Kissinger, they created what they call the Frankenstein of China. Initially, they thought that by befriending China, it would become democratically weapons. And in the process, they gave unequal recognition to China did not deserve to China. They gave all the political forums open to the United communities with government. The West should understand, the democratic countries should understand this position of China. This we are like, which they were trying to use as what they call necklace of pearls against the democratic. Now, suddenly it is moving as a millstone. The world should understand, the government of Switzerland should understand, Germany should understand, America, Britain, France, all of them should understand that China is using their money to sabotage democracy, to occupy the system, the United Nations, etc. So I think the world should realize the reality of this, that is going to see. And China, the way China has added itself into the democratic world should understand it.
But I have the impression, you also mentioned it, Regula, that people, at least in Switzerland, are becoming more critical. Also in Germany, this discussion around this Confucius Institute recently, I think there has been criticism of partnerships, for example, in Switzerland, between Swiss and the Chinese towns. There has been criticism of projects such as China in Zurich. What would you say, Regula? Has there been a shifting opinion here, also a shifting opinion concerning the economic dependencies?
Yes, I'm sure that there is, because I think the last years have really been eye-opening for a lot of Western countries, what happens with China. And if you ask before what can Tibet do, or is it the exiled government of Tibet, to change the things, I think you cannot live alone. You need the support of all the Western countries and the other countries, which see that this is not a situation of development, our world community will way, but it is this is not a business, and it's not a business case that you can have with China. It is something like a world power that wants to dominate the global rules of the game, and not of the basics, not on the basis of universalistic and humanitarian values, but with authoritarian means and economic dominance. And people feel that this is not good and that is a danger. And Switzerland have the possibility now, democracy, to have popular vote. And it was really a mistake that our government, they refused to put this free trade agreement they made with China to a popular vote, because I am sure that there would have been no agreement with this form of completely economic-based policy, and that the Swiss people, the normal people, they would have said no to this special treatment with China. And at the moment in Switzerland, there are really two different positions. There is the position of the government, which is very strongly under pressure also for economic interests. Companies, banks, Swiss banks, they want to invest in China. And this is also very interesting that Switzerland was one of the first countries signing a memorandum of understanding with China because of this Belt and Road initiative. At the beginning, they tried to put in some ideas about human rights should be respected and ethnic minorities should be respected, but China refused, and our ministers signed nevertheless. So we have this memorandum of understanding. That means that it's an intense work for Chinese and Swiss economic organizations together. But this is a lot of critique against this in the parliament and also in the society, in the civil society. And what is really interesting, that the Swiss government now was forced to make a China strategy, 21 to 24, and it's really the first time that our foreign minister, Peter Megan, today, he told openly that things are bad with China, they don't respect the human rights, they don't first time that our foreign minister told that we are really, that they observed a lot of pressure, observance of non-respect of human rights, and this is, for me, this is going to be of change. And now is the question, what do we do? I think there are different concrete decisions to take that we will not take. One of the wishes of the Swiss bank and the global companies in Switzerland was to enlarge the free trade agreement and to have a really representation and to have more possibilities for them to have priority exchange. And if this would be made, I'm sure it would be a no in the parliament, and it would be.
Last few months we had institutional crisis in Afghanistan. And some people think that since 2016 this division came to the community, but that it is not necessarily the truth, because this has been there for a long time. Because of the historical background that composes Tibet as a whole, and also a lot of ignorance of history within the Tibetan community. That is why you see some regionalism of the past, because of the past history. And I also ask Tibetans to study about the law. We are in a democratic country. If you don't understand law, then you cannot make out who's following the rules and who's not following the rules. Then to understand regionalism, you have to understand your own history. I'll be speaking to you tomorrow. It has only been 5 months that I took over. I'll take every possible initiative to make sure that Tibet is united. I'll make them know that China is a common enemy, not amongst ourselves. I'll tell them the truth. I'll give them the natural information about how we need to move forward. So, just words are not enough. I'll show it to them, to our people, through our deeds. So the last 5 months, if you have also watched the Tibetan community for the division, you must have also seen how people come to receive us at every place that we go. That is also symbolic of where the community is going. So even if there is a remnant of division, I've been running around like a man chased by a mad dog in the last 5 months to prove that we can do work despite the differences. There will be differences because it's a democratic setup. We don't expect every Tibetan to speak the same voice. But this is democracy. But then even democracy, you have rights and responsibilities. Even if you have dissenting voices also, it should be reasonable, it should be logical, not based on emotional things. So these things, you think, I'm reaching out already. I've been to Ladakh, 8 days, I've been to Kalimpong, Nambok, Darjeeling, but I don't see any questions from the public about this division. We keep talking about work, we keep doing our work, and people who create division don't even know me. Sometimes even not see me physically. So let us see my judge my work, not my dresses. People are talking about my dress more than my work. So frivolity has gained prominence, not the essence of what we should be doing. Don't worry, this is amongst ourselves. I've been in the group for 20 years. I've been Speaker of Parliament for 7.5 years. Don't worry, I'll handle that.
Is
developments what happened in the last 2, 3, 4 months, I don't see it as a single division. I see it as evolution of democracy. So, really, and whatever happened, I think it was only processes. And those processes can be corrected. Very difficult time. Those, whatever those rules were left, I'm sure this parliament will correct them. So I, as an observer, I don't see it as a symbol of division among the dividends. I see it as a healthy symbol of maturity of the revolution. That's what I think.
So, I don't know where to start. This question is quite a difficult question, but I'll try my best. I mean, here's Vijay, and Sikyong, and Michael. I talked to you about it also. It's about CTA, Central Term Administration, and they should call CTA or Tibetan Permanent Exile. India is our best friend, but still, India doesn't recognize Tibet as an independent country. So that's where the issue of CTA, why we call CTA and not just Tibetan Permanent Exile. I think now in the last 2.5 years, at least 2 years, more than 70% of Indians, they regard China as the main enemy of India, which is like unprecedented in the last 60-70 years. So now Hong Kong, Taiwan was known as the Republic of China. As soon as these troubles came, Taiwan rubbed away the word Republic and said it's Taiwan, not Republic of China, Taiwan. So now, as Sikyong, I think it's so important that this is such a great chance for Tibetans that we be recognized as a political organization, and not just as a guest of India. As a guest of India, we can be anytime, but we can use the 70% of Indians now who know never before ever had known that China is not neutral. Now we are exposed China's brutality and policies. Now I think it's utmost also pushing this to Michael and to you also, but it is so essential that we change the name of Tibetan administration into Tibetan Permanent Exile, because Tibetan Permanent Exile represents the people of Tibet, not just the Tibetan Tibetans outside Tibet. So what is the plan in the next 5 years? Are you ready to change CTA into Tibetan Permanent Exile? Many newspapers they say Tibetan Permanent Exile. Our own government still insists on CTA because we want to please the government so that the government will have less problem. In that way, that's better. So that's what I would do.
We have gone through a lot of discourses on this issue, and we also had a special meeting whereby after that we took this position. We had many issues with the government of India also. From the time we came to exile, there are many Tibetans who don't know the history of how we established ourselves, what are the difficulties that we faced in establishing ourselves. Just to have this view of this organization that I am in Delhi, if you listen to the people who first started this, who worked with this views, there we put this board of officers there, and then there were objections. I'll just give you one sentence. I'll just give you
is in that division.
Do you want to? Yeah, on something?
Just as a concluding, some concluding things that I take home is what we're talking about is not a human rights issue. Tibet is not a minority issue, and we have to tell them about that Switzerland. They have to stop referring to Tibetans as ethnic minority, Indian minority. Tell them the press friends they have to stop using minority. You yourselves have to be careful about the wording, the words that you use. It's a conflict in need of resolution. And unless we talk about it as a conflict, we don't understand that what we're waiting for is a resolution. And a resolution can only come if the international community is its role. International community doesn't feel the need to play a role to resolve a minority issue. It does feel the need to help resolve a conflict between countries. And that's what we have to convey. That's what we have to convey with the language that we use, with the way we talk about Tibet and China.
Thank you for your
Just one comment.
Just one sentence.
Vulnerable handle actually has it in the reverse. We are now being conditioned by China and not the other way around.
I must repeat, our time has disappeared, and I would like to thank our guests, panelists on stage, for this thought-provoking, different perspectives, input, and for the expertise they presented. And thank you to our audience for your interest, for the questions. We didn't have a lot, we didn't have time for more questions. I regret this and I'm sorry about this. But we have another panel tomorrow in Zurich. I don't know if you want to join another one. I'm looking forward to it, and thank you all. I wish you a good evening and safe evening.
Thank you. In my opening statement, I mentioned that we expect the official Switzerland would adjust its view on PRC towards reality, and we would come to know more about this reality today. And I think the speakers have fulfilled our expectations. We signal with the amount of loud applause for them again that they did an impressive job today. And please give them a round. At the end, I want to tell you that exit door to the exit, there is an information table with Michael's book, for example, and there are from our friend Vijay, who is an artistic photographer. There are photos taken by him of His Holiness in the 80s in Dharamsala and Zanskar. They're wonderful, exclusive pictures which you could buy there as sets or individual. They are presented on the table. And our Tibet Focus magazine, you find, you can take with an exclusive interview of Sigmund Bebazilian. as usual in such events, near the exit door there is a donation box, and if you pass there, you make this box happy by filling it up with something. Now we will hand over the traditional kada to the speakers. And everybody will get the kada, but only regular will get the present, because all the other speakers have to work tomorrow again before we get the present. Thank you very much, everybody. We wish you all the best on your way home, and good night.
Okay.